Hey everybody, so welcome to Notes 3.7. This is going to be our first set of notes for Unit 3, Part 2. So we are going to be focusing on this part of the unit on a couple more of those linkage institutions, those things that connect us to the government. And one of those is voting. So when we're looking at voting, we're actually talking about political participation. And that's what all of these linkage institutions are allowing us to do, is to participate and taking part in politics. The most common way that we engage in political participation is voting. So we're going to talk about quite a bit in this video, so bear with me. If you have questions as we are rounding out the video, make sure to let me know, but let's get into it. So we have a couple of learning objectives for this video. Like I said, we're going to be talking about quite a bit, but it's all very, very important. We're going to be describing the voting rights protections in the Constitution as well as in legislation. So we're going to be looking at things like the 15th, 17th, 19th, 24th, 26th Amendments. We're going to be identifying and describing different models of voting behavior, right? What does that decision-making process look like? And then describing trends in voter turnout. So what influences the number of people that actually turn out and vote in elections? So over time, what we need to know is that our electorate, which we'll talk about in a second, has expanded. The number of people that are eligible to vote over time has grown. Now, something to note here, states are the ones responsible for defining citizen qualifications for voting and for managing elections. So this is actually more of a reserved power, if you want to go back to using federalism terminology. Now, states typically did not grant this right to vote equally, and we'll talk about that in a second. So I just want to talk about some key definitions here. Anytime that I'm talking about the electorate, I'm referring to the group, like basically the country, the people that are eligible to vote in an election. And anytime that I talk about the franchise or being disenfranchised or suffrage, I'm referring to the right to vote. So just make sure that you are, thinking about those terms as we go through this. Now, originally, property-owning white men were the only group that could vote. And that was if you're going back to Unit 1, looking at the elite model of democracy that our framers were really kind of going for as they were, founding this country in our founding documents. Now, states didn't expand the electorate and expand the right to vote or suffrage equally, as I mentioned before. What we are going to see is over time, though, especially starting in the 1930s with Jackson, this is going to, we're going to see an increase in participation. In the 1930s, we see the end of that property owning requirement. And we start to see voting for the common man. Now, it's still men only and white men, but we're starting to see more universal male suffrage become kind of the norm. Okay, so this is going to contribute to quite a bit of the anti-elitism that we will see in these next couple of slides. Now, we see some constitutional and legislative protections, and I want to give you guys a disclaimer here. I am not going in chronological order. I know that some of you, your brains work that way. I thought it would be more beneficial to kind of go by topic. So we're going to start with constitutional and legislative protections for minority groups in terms of race and ethnicity. So we're going to start with the 15th Amendment. This was passed in 1870, and it gives former slaves and free Black males the right to vote. So we're still only seeing men at this point. And this is that very first federal mandate that affected state voting requirements. So really, again, if you're thinking about federalism, this is shifting that power to the national government because it's a federal mandate. Now, something to note, because this didn't mean that all of a sudden African-American men were able to just vote and things were great, right? The Constitution forbids religious tests for holding public office, but they don't have any, or it doesn't have any requirement for tests in determining who can vote. So what we see happen is states in reality pass various policies and laws that do prevent African American men from actually participating in politics. So we see things like the literacy tests, poll taxes, grandfather clauses, and the white primary. And these are, in essence, loopholes to that 15th Amendment. Now, literacy tests were actually tests that you would sit down and take. They were written, and it was to determine if you were, intelligent enough to be able to vote. The issue with the literacy test was you actually had to be able to read, and they were intentionally confusing. And slaves who had been freed, remember, they were not being educated. So that was a barrier for them. They could not pass the literacy tests. Poll taxes were fees that you had to pay to be able to vote. Former slaves couldn't pay the poll tax. Grandfather clauses allowed states to recognize registering voters as they would have recognized their grandfather. So think about that for a second. If a former slave and a free Black man goes to register to vote, they're not going to be able to register under this grandfather clause because their grandfather would not have been eligible to register. So those are going to really allow whites who might be poor and who might be illiterate and not able to pay poll taxes or literacy tests to get around those requirements. And then we also see something called the white primary, and we see Southern states and the parties of the states actually kind of defining voting population as white men's clubs. So that did also restrict the number of minorities that could participate in federal elections as well. Now, in 1957, we see the first act or bill since Reconstruction after the Civil War that is going to address discrimination in voter registration. And what we see is that this had a significant impact in increasing voter registration among minorities. So prior to World War II, in the southern states, only about 3% of minorities, African Americans, were registered to vote. After this act, we see that jump anywhere from 6% to 66%. So yeah, I know 6% is not that big of a jump, but we do see an increase in the number of, African Americans and minorities registered at least to vote. Now, the 24th Amendment is going to outlaw that poll tax in federal elections. So the Supreme Court is going to say, like, federal or Congress and, the entire government's going to say, like, you can't require a fee to be able to vote. And this is going to expand suffrage to minorities predominantly, but also in the long run, the poor as well, those people who might not have been minorities, but could still not pay the poll tax. Then the Voting Rights Act of 1965 is going to be the most effective bill to bring the Black populace into participating in politics. This is going to outlaw those literacy tests, give federal oversight to states with voting requirements like that, and low turnout. So it's going to make the federal government or allow the federal government to kind of be a watchful eye over states to see if they are actually discriminating against African Americans and prevent that from happening. So that is a very quick overview of the expansion of suffrage to minorities over time, but we do also see some constitutional and legislative protections for other groups in our country. So in 1920, we see the passage of the 19th Amendment with women's suffrage. 26th Amendment in 1971 is going to lower that voting age in federal elections to 18. So this is going to expand the voting age from 18 to 20-year-olds, whereas before it had been 21. So at this point, by 1971, young adults are going to be that last group to gain the right to vote. Now, the reason why now in 1971 we see the voting age lowered is predominantly with the wars that had gone on prior to this time period, World War II, Vietnam. And we see the draft age, right, the minimum age that you were required to serve your country in the military, lowered to 18. And the argument became, look, if I'm old enough to fight for my country and die for my country, I should be able to vote for my country. And that kind of was the rallying cry for those in favor of the 26th Amendment. The 17th Amendment is also going to not necessarily give a group the right to vote, but it's going to expand really participatory democracy. This is going to allow for the direct election of U.S. senators. And before, it used to be the state legislatures that were the ones selecting senators. So under our original Constitution, the House was the only group that was directly elected by the people. And this is going to be a change away from elitism into more participatory democracy and make the process more democratic. And then we finally have the 23rd Amendment in 1961. Now, this gives Washington, D.C. representation in the Electoral College. They get 3 votes to vote for president. And the reason why now, right, why did it take until 1961? If you think about Washington, D.C., D.C. stands for the District of Columbia. It's not a state, and therefore it didn't have any representation in Congress. So now they still don't have representation in Congress, but they are able to vote for president. So that's why it's 538 electoral votes versus 535. Okay, I know I'm going kind of quickly, but we have a lot to get through here. So let's talk about the models of voting behavior, right? What are people thinking of when they make their decisions on how to vote? So let's talk about rational choice voting. Rational choice voting is when a voter examines an issue or a candidate, their campaign promises, their platform points, and they decide to vote in the way that seems to most benefit them. And this can be seen as selfish, but really it's the rational choice. You are doing what you believe is best. Now, this could be different from voter to voter. In fact, it does vary from voter to voter, right? I could approach the voting booth or the poll with, I want to do what's in my best interest, my individual interest at the top, right? Who will help me obtain medical care, right? Another person could act out of interest for the larger group instead, right? What is best for America? What is best for our public schools? Right? If there is a citizen in using this rational choice voting, they might care about collecting Social Security. That might be the one thing that they're looking at in terms of candidate promises and platform points. I may vote for that same candidate if that issue has a priority for me. If it doesn't, I'm not. So it's really all about the person's individual preferences here and what matters to them. Now, retrospective voting is when a voter looks backwards to consider the track record of a candidate and consider their accomplishments while in office as they're making their decision. So they're evaluating essentially the performance of the party in power. So for example, if Republicans are in control of both parts of Congress and the White House, and let's say that there's an economic downturn, the economy tanks for whatever reason, a retrospective voter, especially a retrospective independent voter, is going to likely cast a vote for Democrats instead of Republicans, because in their mind, Republicans were the ones that kind of led to this economic downturn. So they're looking at how the party in power has performed and making their decision based on that. Now, opposite of retrospective is prospective voting. You're looking at the prospects of the candidate. The voter is going to anticipate the future. They'll consider what the candidate is promising, any proposed initiatives that they have when making their decision in terms of who to vote for. So one of the biggest examples that I can think of in modern, like the last 8 years here, or 4 years even, in 2020 and in 2016, the Democratic Party came down to, Bernie Sanders being one of the final potential candidates for the nomination. And he was running on and campaigning for things like Medicare for all, free tuition at public universities, raising the minimum wage to $15. So a prospective voter was looking at Bernie Sanders and supporting Bernie Sanders, or a candidate like Bernie Sanders, with a vision for the future that they wanted. Now, prospective voting is a really good way of doing it, but it also kind of is a negative for the actual candidate because of something called the mandate theory of elections. The mandate theory is kind of this obligation of the winner. So let's say that Bernie Sanders had won. According to this mandate theory of elections, he would have had a mandate or kind of an informal requirement from the people to carry on and carry out these promises, his platform points, and those initiatives. And his success then, as a retrospective voter, could have been either positive or negative, depending on how well he could have been able to get those policies out. So voters, as they, age and as things happen in the country, you're not just a prospective voter. You shift your decision making over time. And then we have party line voting. And this is pretty common, especially among younger citizens who might not be as informed on issues. Citizens who affiliate and identify with a political party are going to likely vote with that party at most opportunities. So right down the ballot, they're going to vote all Republican, all Democrat. This is different from an independent or from independents who we saw usually will split their ballot. This is not splitting their ballot. This is going right down the ballot and voting along party lines. Party identification is the easiest way to predict a voter's habits, right? If you have a strong loyalty to a party, you are going to be pretty likely to vote all the way down for that party. Now, that's not to say that there aren't exceptions. Your likelihood of voting along party lines can be impacted by the candidates as well as important issues at the time, right? So we talked about candidate-centered campaigns and how those have become more popular. More and more, the personality of the candidate, the competency of the candidate, the integrity of the candidate is going to be a really big factor in deciding who people vote for. So even if a person identifies as a Democrat, if they do not see this Democratic candidate as competent or having integrity, they could, and a lot have in recent years, move parties and vote for a candidate that is a Republican. So those candidate-centered campaigns that we see more in modern times can impact this party line voting. And issues going on at the time as well can impact this party line voting, right? And this kind of goes back to kind of some retrospective voting here, right? We often call voters who deal or vote based on how the economy is doing pocketbook voters, right? For them, the economy is at the top of the list. And if the economy is in a downturn, the candidate in power, we call them the incumbent, is usually held responsible for that downturn. So the vote might tend to go toward the challenger then as well, which may be against that political party. So we do see some variation and some characteristics that influence that. All right, our final topic for this video is voter turnout. Voter turnout is the number of voters who actually cast votes as a percentage of the voting age population, which is 18 and up. So how many people are eligible to vote? How many actually come out and vote? And that's how we get our voter turnout rate. Since the 1960s and 70s, this has decreased tremendously, largely due to mistrust in government through Vietnam and Nixon. I know I've brought that up a lot in class. People are de-aligning, or we've seen political de-alignment, moving away from party identification over time. It's to the point where, in midterm elections, which we'll talk about in a second, we see less than 30% voter turnout. So we definitely have seen a decrease over time. Now, we will take a look in class at how this has changed in 2020, right? We're still getting data from voter turnout in 2020, which we will analyze in class because that's kind of an anomaly. Now, there are a couple of things that impact voter turnout structurally. The type of election is a huge indicator, and I'll show you what I mean by that when we look at some graphs. More voters will cast ballots during presidential elections than in midterm elections. And midterm elections happen every 2 years at the midway point in a president's term. So Trump started his first term. The election was in 2016. The midterm election was 2018. Okay, so the midterm election for this next presidential term will be 2022. And the voter turnout in those is much, much less it's much lower, I should say, just because it doesn't get as much, media coverage. It's just not as important in the eyes of the voter as a presidential election. And we've also taken a look at how voter apathy or a lack of concern for the election outcome has risen over time and can impact voter turnout. So, a big factor in what determines your likelihood of voting is the degree to which you believe that your vote actually makes a difference or it matters. So, someone with low political efficacy is going to think, nope, not going to vote. What does it matter anyway? Someone with high political efficacy, on the other hand, is going to say, okay, my vote actually matters. I can contribute something if I vote. Okay, so this is both a structural and also an individual characteristic that impacts voter turnout. So let's take a look at who is voting in terms of voter turnout. And we're going to look at 4 voting blocks or demographics that vote in noticeable patterns. And we've kind of talked about these already in terms of what party they vote for, but let's take a look at how these demographic characteristics influence voter turnout. So the number one factor in determining the likelihood of you voting is education. The more education you have, meaning into college or post-grad, the more likely you are to actually vote. And then this is also linked to socioeconomic status, right? If you look at data, the more education you have, the more money you are likely to earn versus someone who has maybe just a high school degree. So we see that same trend when we're looking at household income. In terms of age, the older generations are going to be more likely to vote. And part of that is, younger people just don't have the life experience to know what issues might affect them. They lack strong views on issues, and their voter turnout is going to increase with age, we find. Now, interestingly enough, in the very first election where 18-year-olds were allowed to vote, voter turnout went way down. So we do see lack of political efficacy and voter apathy when it comes to younger generations, but the older generations turn out in much, much higher numbers. In terms of race, Caucasians, whites are more likely to vote than minorities. And we did see a switch in that in 2008 and 2012 with African Americans, but Caucasians are much more likely to vote. But other ethnicities are higher with comparable education. So education factor does increase the likelihood of voting. Gender, there is a gender gap, not only in whether they identify as Republican or Democrat, but also how likely they are to vote. We do see a slight trend in females being more likely to vote than males. And I did want to point out that these traits are cumulative. So the more traits that you share, the more likely it is that you are to vote. So let's say, right, as a white female in their 60s with a doctorate degree, that would be the highest level or likelihood that someone would be able to vote. So they are cumulative. So I just wanted to show you some of the trends here. This is for gender. You can see that since the 80s, women, this green line here, are more likely to vote than men in elections. I didn't include any 2020 data, guys, only because we're still collecting it. And then here is turnout rates by education. And I wanted to show you guys what I meant by more people vote in presidential elections. Every time you see a peak here, it's a presidential year, right? So you can definitely see a significant drop off when it comes to midterm versus presidential elections. But all the way down at the bottom here, you see less than high school, right? Hovering around like 40%, right? Maybe getting a little higher. High school graduation, some college, and then postgraduate, right? You can see all the way up to likelihood of 80% or like 75% in 2018. And then, move myself over here, that is the same when it comes to income, right? Because the more education you have, the more likely you make more money. So, as we see in this graph, family income, as we get up into the hundreds of thousands, the 6 figures, right, that becomes an astronomically high voter turnout percentage. Turnout by age, you can kind of see, there we go. You can see that in the actual graph here, 60 and up is all the way up at the very top versus 18 to 29. And again, you see those differences in presidential versus midterm elections. And then here we have by race and ethnicity. So you can see what I meant when I said in 2008 and 2012, African Americans or non-Hispanic Blacks were higher than any other racial group. However, predominantly Caucasians are the ones predominating here. All right, guys, so that was a lot. So I apologize, but I wanted to get through all of that so we can talk about these in class. So you're going to describe the voting right protections in the Constitution and in legislation, identify and define different models of voting behavior, and describe trends in voter turnout over time. So please make sure you're reaching out if you have any questions. I will see you guys in class, and make sure to rewind and get anything that you need to on the notes, and I will talk to you guys soon.